Good. Rabbi Isai, welcome back to Yerushalmi Peah. We are Daf 12a. The share is brought to you by myself, with Siyata Dishmaya, Gerard Sabri Mortgages Limited. Klal Amru, the Chachamim said, with various produce which is Chaim Peah. Kol Shu Eichel, anything which is edible, Nishma, and the owners are careful to guard it, to Gidula min haaretz, and the roots get nourishment from the ground. And everything is cut at once. And you guard it in storage to eat it throughout the year. So it's a sort of fruit which will last for a long time. Chayav Peah, there is an obligation on Peah. Okay, so all these conditions is gathered at once. It lasts in storage. So we're excluding hefker, for example, which is not guarded. We're excluding vegetables like mushrooms and things which don't get nourishment from the ground. Okay. Now, the Rishonim argue, according to some Rishonim, idea of Peah is minat Torah. According to some Rishonim, actually, it's Machlokes Bavli in Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi seems to hold that a lot of produce is Chayav minat Torah. The Bavli holds only dogon tirosh for Yitzchok, right? Grain, wine, and oil. Whereas other fruits are only a chiyuv midrabanan. We'll talk about that at some other point. But the idea of things which are guarded and last. Now, grapes don't necessarily last, but you can convert them into wine, and wine lasts. The olives can be pickled, right, and they will last. So all these rules. So what we got? It's edible, it's guarded, it grows from the ground. You gather it at once and you store it. Chayav b'peah, v'hatzvua, and the 5 types of grain, v'hakidnis. These are types of pulses and beans, bichlal, that are included in this. That they have all these conditions. They're Chayav Peah. Now there are trees which also have these conditions, and these are ha'oik, which some translate as sumac, v'hacharuvim and carobs. They're guys in mashkedim, the nuts and almonds. Ha'gefanim and reminding the vines and the pomegranates. Hazesim atzmarim, the olives and the dates. Chayovim b'peah. They are obligated in Peah. The Rambam seems to imply. We said everything's gathered at once. The Rambam seems to imply like every tree. So a tree that produces all its fruit in one go, we'll look at each and every tree rather than the whole field. We'll look at each tree, how it produces its produce. Okay? And according to some Rishonim, these are with trees, these type of trees that we've mentioned, they're the ones that have all the conditions. Other types of trees might be potter from Peah because they don't have all the conditions. So no citrus fruit. That's how some want to learn. The Rambam is mashma that these trees are only an example, that there are other trees also that have a chiyuv of Peah. Okay? We said, how are we mentioning vines? Vines are going to rot. They're not going to last. So we said they might rot, but they last because you make wine out of it and so on. And wine is something which will last for a long time. Okay? Let's carry on. Klal Amru b'Peah, be'elan, etc. So we bring another brisa of a kutzrechem, when you'll start cutting everything. Don't finish off your field together like a the word of a kutzrechem, so that's when you're gathering everything, let's say with a sickle or a scythe. Tolesh, if you detach it with your hand, minayin. Talmud that's why it says liksar, right? The extra word liksar comes to include if you cut it with your hand as well. There's still a chiyuv of Peah. But we still don't know. That's if you do it in a hand, where you don't uproot the roots. What about if you're uprooting it? No, the extra word, the end of the passage, it comes to include if you uproot it. That's all very well grain. Kidneys minayin. How do we see that these other kidneys, these other pulses are also chayav? That's why it says artzechem. So we learn anything that grows in the ground, close to the ground, is chayav b'peah. Okay? Right, artzechem is an extra word. It could have just said katzirchem. It's telling you here, anything grows in the ground like various types of pulses. Okay. As we already said, types of vegetables are excluded because of other drushes. Okay. Now we still don't know. We know about grains that grow close to the ground. Ilonos. What about the trees where the fruit doesn't grow close to the ground? Menayin. Talmud that's why it says sadcha. To include the trees. Okay, to where all these expressions we're comparing to kotzir, just like stam kotzir is all the 5 conditions. So all these 5 things which have all these conditions is chayav with Peah. Tani, we learned in a brisa, zarein, you're allowed to sow zraim, which is like produce or vegetables. V'zarei ilan ka'achas, and tree seeds together. Notice a kalayim. V'zareya min hachatzanim, when you sow from the pips of the vines together with produce or vegetables, then that's already klai kerem. Then like arbaim, then you get lashes. You've been over the is of kalayim when there's vines mixed with other seeds. Okay, now we bring us also this Amar Zira, because it says in the Torah the is of kalayim, like Tizra kamacha kalayim. So we learn even ikka kamacha, your main vine, like your main orchard, well, your main vineyard, as it were, like Tizra kalayim, don't start throwing in other seeds and so on. So the Brisa says if you sow the geffen with the tavua or vegetables, you get lashes for that. Okay. The Raavad actually holds you can't sow produce or vegetables together with tree seeds. So that's the Raavad shitta. Okay. Rav Yehuda and Kapad Kai Rav Yossi. So he asked Tamad Amri. Now there, we're talking about the Issa Kalayim. They said Ein Zarei Ilan Kruin Zraim. So the tree seeds are not called seeds. So you're allowed to sow them together with produce or vegetables. There's no Issa Kalayim. But as far as Hechsher, now this is something completely different. This is as far as making things susceptible to receive Tumah, right? And Atama, now we say, Zarei Ilan Karuyin Zraim, tree seeds are called seeds, and Dinei Hechsher of being Mukhsha, susceptible to receive Tumah, does apply, right? Now, although we weren't really talking about that, and it's not really, I mean, that din of Hechsher Lekabel Tumah wasn't only said on food called zera, right? It applies to other types of food. It applies to meat as well, right? Any food. So why is there a question? It could be just from the halachas of Hechsher Lekabel Tumah is learned from the psukim, zera, zerua, shei zarea. Maybe only these things, Hechsher Tumah comes for maybe Tumas Sheretz, whatever. So what have we got here? But back to our question then. Atama Zari Ilan Kruin Zraim. Here, tree seeds are called seeds as far as Hechsher is concerned. So Amalei, so he answers back. Tamam, with the Issa Kalayim, where the Torah says you mustn't sow Kalayim, the Zera, etc. Mir Takosuv, as Derech Ben Adam, as She'ein Derech Ben Adam, there's going nice and Zeraim. So the Torah reduced those other types of seeds because the people don't call them Zeraim. They don't call them that. But with Hechsher for receiving Tumah, Riba HaKosuv, the Torah included all the seeds. Whereas Mefurish in the Torah it says, Zera Zerua, Asher Yizareah. Right? So it's always all sorts of seeds are included in the Hechsher for receiving Tumah. Okay? Fine. Some want to learn the Chiyah Peah from all types of things growing from the following psukim. It says in the Torah, Ki tiv sar kamacha. Now the Torah says, Laita oila lacharecha. Okay? Now when you're reaping your vineyard, Laita oila lacharecha. Now this pasuk, Laita oila, in the Bavli, Laita oila is a reference to oilalim, which is a special din with premature grapes that you have to leave them for the fall. Right? The Yerushalmi is not using that pasuk for that. Yerushalmi is using this pasuk, Laita oila lacharecha, is talking about oila lais in a kerem. Okay, we know about the idea of grapes that don't ripen, but the word oila lais was already mentioned in Vayikra, is mentioned elsewhere, and is not needed for this. Therefore, our Gemara, the Yerushalmi, uses this pasuk to tell me about peah in a vineyard. Okay, because I don't need oila lais, we know that elsewhere. Therefore, we'll use it for the idea of peah in a vineyard. Later, oila lacharecha. How do we learn Chiyah Peah from here? It means later daktek. Don't finish off when you're ripe and cutting everything. Don't finish off all the grapes. Leave a bit left behind. Like we say in Eicha, where it talks about the Nabi is asking about the enemies. All their bad should be before you. Like you, so all the bad deeds should come and punish them like you did with the Jewish people, and you punish them, right? Means don't be so particular to finish off the vineyard. Now another source of peah with other things that grow, it says in the Torah, again, now when you're gathering all your olives, don't take the splendor of the tree. So from here we learn there's a chiyuv to leave peah from the olive trees. Now how do we learn chiyuv mitzvahs peah from this pasuk? The beauty of the tree is peah. How do we see this? Because we find Typical Yerushalmi, this Rabbi Sai. Remember how you bring psukim from all over the place to support, different ideas? So what have we got here? We've got, it says the issue of cutting the hair, hakofas harosh, covering all the hair on the head. Lo takifu ba'as roshchem. Don't destroy ba'az zakanecha. Okay. So lacking of peas harosh is called hashchasa, destruction. And they are tiferes, they're a beauty for the head. So with a tree, pa'as ha'ilad means the beauty of the tree. And the Torah says, when you're gathering the olives, lo tefa'er acharecha, don't remove the beauty. Don't take the beauty of the tree, but leave peah for the olives. You hear that? So it's called beauty, and the beauty of the tree is the olives. How do we know it's called beauty? Because of when you cut your hair. So therefore, we learn from this pasuk a chiyuv peah with olives. So we have the word olalim we had with vines, and we have tifarta, etc. We have here lo tefa'er acharecha, we have with olives. Okay, so we have two sources for the idea of peah. Now, Oma zayis for kerem. Now these two are unique. Shmiuchadin shelikidas ka'achas. You gather them in one go, and then you store them. So because they last for a long time, as we said, the vineyard, the grapes may last as wine. The olives can be pickled. Chayovin b'peah. They have a peah obligation, as we've just seen. So everything which has the same conditions is chayav b'peah. Now wait a minute. Those two are shein chayavim bebikurim. They have bikurim obligation as well. So let's say anything. Let's say only shus haminim, which is chayav bikurim, maybe has the din of peah. How do you know everything? That's why it says kesircha. Afilu kesir name you're cutting rice. Afilu kesir or millets, whatever it is, a chiyuv peah. So we see. They're not chayav, and these things definitely have no bikurim. So just also other things that grow, even though they're not chayav bikurim, anything which is like the olive and the vine, they're gathered in one go and they're kept for storage, they are chayav b'peah. Now, why do I need two sources? Why do you want to mention vines? Just tell me olives. Because if I just said olives, didn't tell you vine, I would say, well, the olives, zayis, shu potav and aperet. Peret is the other type of the little grapes which don't ripen properly. There's the small ones, the ones that don't ripen. Again, all the ones that are forgotten behind. No, the peret are the grapes that fall. Yeah, the grapes that fall. He says over here, peret kamachalo telake. You can't gather the single grapes that fall at the time of the harvest. You have to leave them for the poor. So zayis doesn't have this din. So therefore, maybe it's chayav b'peah. But a vine, shul kerem shul chayav b'peret, which does have this din of these single grapes, maybe lo yeh chayav b'peah, maybe it won't have peah. That's why we need to tell you there's a chiyuv of peah with a vineyard, to tell me even though there's a peret obligation, there's also a peah obligation. Or it could be, we could also say that the Torah needed to mention zayis, maybe it's not enough with kerem, because if I told you just with a vineyard, the other way around, if I just told you kerem and not with an olives, I'll say like this: kerem shulchayav b'peret. Right, kerem has the peret obligation of the single grapes, therefore you chayav b'peah. Therefore, there's a peah obligation. But olives shul potav and peret, it doesn't have that single obligation of single olives. Therefore, you potav and peah. Maybe there's no peah obligation. That's why we need them both. We couldn't learn from each one on its own. You might have thought it's got special din with peret, etc. You follow? So each of them together have the obligation of peah. Okay? We couldn't have learned zayis from kerem. You could say, right, it's got extra mitzvah peret, therefore it's chayav peah, but zayis is possible to peret. So we need to mention both. Now, Yatza zayis, so olives have a chiv obligation of peah. V'limen al kol haloshon. Remember, I quoted before that the Yerushalmi seems to put a bigger limud. Remember, the Bavli in can't remember what it is, but I think it's Sanhedrin. Bavli talks about Dagoncha Tirosh Chavitz Haracha, but Yerushalmi seems to include more. So Yatza zayis, v'limen al kol haloshon. All the other trees are chayav with peah. Right, all the other trees with the mamotzino, just like olives are potel, providing all those conditions apply. Okay. Right. Yatza kerem, v'limed al atzmai peah as well, and the vineyard also has an obligation. and teaching upon itself that it's got a chiyuv peah. Now, you couldn't learn peah from kerem from zayis, so we've got that as well. Just like the olives comes and tells me all the other trees. Now, why don't we say that we use the din of a vineyard and learn that all other trees have a din like peret, that these single grapes that flow, let's say all other trees have the same din. Why don't we learn a binyan av from a vineyard to make a chiyuv of peret on all the other trees? Something which is similar to both, like peah, mentioned with the olives, mentioned with the grapes. Melame, that can be a binyan av to the other trees. But something which is not mentioned in both, peret is only mentioned with the vineyard. It can't be a binyan av to other trees. Therefore, we learn a chiyuv peah to all the trees, but we can't learn a chiyuv of peret to all the trees of the vineyard. Okay? Now, some say, as we said, the peret is not shaykh with an olive, because peret is these single grapes. And with the olive tree, you don't have the messias, because all the olives stay hanging on the tree. And you don't get single olives. Okay? Some say there is an opportunity for peret with olives, the ones that fall in the ground at the time of gathering, but the Torah rejected it, didn't say there's a chiyuv, that it's only a din with kerem and not a din with the olives. Okay. So what we got? We got two sources in the Torah for the chiyuv of peah for all the things that grow, whether it's mamatzino or whatever. We're learning from these other two, and learning all these others. Many Rishonim therefore hold there's a chiyuv on all the others. Rabbeinu Tam learns from the Bavli. It's in Chulin Kuf Lamed Aleph. Dagan Tiresh v'Yitzchok only achayev and peah. Everything else is only rabbinical. Fine. Okay. Where are we up to? Adate de Rishmanicha. Now, we said the Torah mentioned chiyuv peah with the kerem as well, because otherwise I might have thought kerem does not have peah because it's got a peret in. So let's see. Adate de Rishmanicha. I understand why you have to mention peah with a vineyard. The Rishma Darash. Now he learns like this. Kol Darash hu bichlal. Something which was within a klal, a general rule. Now, a single rule is set out differently. It's got one unique situation. Well, that takes it out of the general rule. You can't apply it the same to everything else anymore. You've got to go and put it back. If something is unique in one aspect, it means it's not part of the general rule anymore. You can't put it back until you're told to. Kerem has this unique din of peret, right? And that singles it out. No other fruit has that. And therefore, you can't learn from it. So therefore, we need to mention peah with a kerem, because kerem was excluded from the other trees. It's got this special din of peret. Therefore, it can't be put in the general klal. You need the Torah to go and put it back and say there is a chiyuv peah. According to the Chachamim, now they argue with Rishma. They say, look, if it was in the general rule, so what if it's got one exception? So what? It still stays within the general rule. It doesn't matter if it has one exception. It can still have the exception and still stay in the general rule. So according to them, although there is a mitzvah peret, it stays in the general rule as far as chiyuv peah. If that's the case, why do I need to mention peah with a vineyard? I would have known it in a way. It's the same as all other trees, and I don't care that there's one din of peret which doesn't apply. Ravavin said, you know something? If kerem would have been excluded, if that was the only one coming out of the klal to tell me about chiyuv peah, then you would have had a good question. The klal includes all the trees, kerem is included, even though there's a mitzvah peah, it's fair enough, and you don't need to learn a chiyuv peah from that. But achshav sheyatza kerem v'zayis, there's two things that are singled out from the klal to tell you a chiyuv peah with trees. Now, without the Torah mentioning vineyard and olives for chiyuv peah, we would not have known other trees have a chiyuv peah. So the Torah wrote a chiyuv peah with olives to tell me for all the trees. So if that's the case, we understand why the Torah had to mention another chiyuv with a vineyard, was you couldn't have learnt kerem, vineyard from olives, because we said, Ilo nema zayis, if I just had olives, not the vineyard, I used to be able to say, well, zayis, shul potim and aperet. Remember, if you just had olives, we'll say, well, olives don't have this din of the small grapes, and therefore chayav b'peah, therefore she should be chayav b'peah. Kerem, a vineyard, shu chayav b'peret, maybe because it's got one chiyuv on the small grapes, maybe you potem in apeh. I don't know how that sounds, but maybe it should be exempt from Peah. So we couldn't have learned Keren from Zayis. And therefore you understand why the Torah had to mention Chiyuv Peah separately with the vineyard, even according to the Chachamim. Because they're saying, look, we couldn't have learnt it from Zayis. Zayis has got whatever it is. You know, you might have thought that it's potter on Peah, Chaim Peah. When Keren which has Peah, maybe it's potter. So we had to mention it. So to summarize, the Pasuk mentioned with olives tells me a Chiyuv Peah with olives. We learn Chiyuv Peah to other trees which are similar, the Shivas Aminim. Okay, the Pasuk with the vineyard tells you a Chiyuv Peah with a vineyard, Kitziracha, even things which are not the Shivas Haminim, like rice and millet, we said according to Yerushalmi. And from here we learn that the Chiyuv Peah mentioned with olives and the vineyard is Chiyuv Peah for all the other trees, even if they are not Shivas Haminim, providing they have those 5 conditions that we mentioned in the Mishnah. So they gathered at one go, and they kept for storage, etc. Yeah, and they get nourishment from the ground, etc. As we said. Now, just like we say as far as the mitzvah of Peah that the Torah spoke about reaping the Tvua and the Kerem, it's cut in one go, why don't we say the same thing with the worker? Why don't we say the right that a worker has to eat fruit of the balabais, we said in the Torah with Tvua and Kerem, should apply also with fruit which lasts with all these conditions. So we're saying maybe a worker can only take fruit which has all these conditions. Oh, Rabbi Yoina Shadi, no, that's different. Why? You'll see it says v'katafta melilos b'yadcha. Right? When you're coming and you're working, you're cutting with your hand. The worker has the right to cut from his hand. Even something which is not going to last is eaten straight away after you comes to your hands. We learn there's a zechus, so he can eat the fruit. The worker he's allowed to eat it. V'hatamarim and the dates. Now these are dates which will never ripen. They are exempt. Because the first ones don't wait to ripen for the last ones. So the dates, the first ones, the other ones are ripened, these are ripened, the other ones are not ripened. Basically, they're not cut in one go. Right? Therefore, they are potter. Now, it's mashma the Chachamim argue on the din of Rabbi Yossi. Yos, it makes sense. Rabbi Yossi Yehuda, what Rabbi Yossi Yehuda is saying, that these dates don't really apply Peah. They should be potter. Ma'atav Rabbanon, why do the Chachamim argue and hold they are chayav Peah? Razira. The reason why the Chachamim say are chayav, neshukula matilin sa'ar ba'sachas. All these dates reach a certain stage of the beginning of ripening in one period of time. The early stage ripening is across the board. So even though the end ripening is at different stages, but the early stage is the same. And since they reach that early stage at the same time, it's called likitas and ka'achas, and therefore they're chayav Peah. Okay? Rabbi Yitzchok ben Chakula, Shum ben Levi, Tervein Amrin, they said hakulkus. Now, what this is, some say it's a cabbage. Some say it's like a loof, type of onion. Different opinions what it is.
So it's an edible root of a bean.
Thank you. Edible root of a bean, whatever that is. Tervein Amrin, hakulkus is keyerek, as far as vegetables, as far as maestros, that the Masechet with vegetables begins first of Tishri with vegetables, not Tu B'Shvat, right? V'lashvius, and any aftergrowths which grow in the 7th year are also like vegetables. Or Peah, and it's no Chiyuv Peah like most vegetables, they don't last. Or Kilayim, now some have a Girsa Bikurim, but the better Girsa is Kilayim. You can't sow it with grain or vines like other vegetables. L'nadarim, and as far as one who makes a vow not to have vegetables, Sricha, that is a question, is it considered a plant in this way, like a vegetable or not? That's a question with Nadarim. Nadarim will depend on the way what some people call it. Some people call it a vegetable, some call it a tree. When you make a neder, what did you have in mind? So that's a question as to what it would be. Okay, we're up to the Mishnah. You should leave Peah from the standing crop, basically, before it's cut, right? Nevertheless, if you didn't do that, you still have to separate Peah once it's been cut and leave it for the poor. Now, we're talking about the Chiyuv Meiser from Peah now, which was given from produce which has been cut. And we're going to talk about halacha as well, about Chiyuv Meiser from other things. So, la'ayla, even after the produce has been cut, hu naisen mishum Peah, the owner can leave the crop for the poor. And what he gives for Peah is potem and a maestros achimareach, until the produce is stacked up and smoothed out, which is the stage of the process it goes through. Until it gets to that stage, right, you can leave Peah and there's no Meiser obligation, right? From the time that the owner does start smoothing out and piling up his produce, that's when the Meiser obligation comes about. But Noisei, Mishum Hefka. And also you can give the produce to the poor as Hefka, and what you give for Hefka is Potter Min HaMasros. And that's also Potter from Maestros, Ad Shimarech, until you pile it up and smoothen it out. From the time that you smooth out the produce, then the Meiser obligation begins. So basically, Peah is Potter from Maestros, right? But if you waited and you smoothed it out, and then once you reach that stage, even if now you separate Peah, right, after you smoothed it out, then I'm afraid the produce is Chiyuv Maser. So it's considered Tevel. That Peah is Tevel until the Maser. And he says Peah, usual Peah is also Potter from Truma as well. The Tana doesn't mention it because it's not much compared to Maser, right? So the Maser obligation depends on that stacking and smoothing out, right? So if you separate Peah, usually you're not Chaim Maser, as we said, but if you separate Peah after the smoothing out, then I'm afraid there was already a Maser obligation, and the Peah that you separate now has a Chiyuv Maser because that obligation has come about. The fact that you call it Peah now does not remove that Maser obligation. Okay? You can give produce to your animals, the wild animals, the birds, Potter and Amastris, and that's also Potter. This is before the stacking, before the smoothing. Until it's smoothed out. And you can take the produce from the grains, the granary, and sow it back into the ground. Or Potter and Amastris, and it's Potter until the stacking. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. That is the view of Rabbi Akiva. So, according to him, you can put it back in the ground, and you're not chiyuv. There's no chiyuv maestros coming about. If they acquired the granary and maestros shalahen, the meiser they have to separate belongs to them. Until they smooth out the produce, and then the chiyuv tzvur comes about trumas and maestros. And if they acquired it after stacking, they have to give the truma and maser to Kohenim and other Levim. They can't keep it for themselves. Hamagdish, one who makes hekdash's grain, or poiter, then redeems it later, Chaim b'maestros, he has an obligation, until the produce of hekdash has been stacked up by the treasurer, by the gizbar. In that situation, if you redeem it after that, you are potter from Trumas and Maestros. So when the gizbar does the smoothing out, and then you go and buy it later, you are potter from Trumas and Maestros. Okay? Now, so we said there is a din of chiyuv of Peah, and you're potter from Maestros until the produce is smoothed out. Once you smoothed it out, there is an obligation in Maser, including what you now separate as Peah. Now, what about Bikurim now? If it's been smoothed out and you now separate Bikurim, usually Bikurim is not chayav with Maser. Right? Bikurim is like the first on the list, as it were. And it's not Chayav Truma or Maser. So what we're saying now, everything's been stacked up. Now what happens? Rabbi Yosef Yaakov Azavdi b'Shem Rabbi Bo, Rabbi Nechemia bar Ukva, or Mati bar Samsei b'Shem Rabbi Yochanan. Hifish Bikurim Mikri Memurach. If you separate Bikurim from after it's been stacked up, Parta mi Truma Gedaila. You don't have to separate Truma Gedaila for Bikurim, even though the Trumas and Maestros obligation has already come. Now the Bra brings the source for this. The Brisa says this. We said the pay obligation you can do it, and you're potter from Maser until the smoothing, the stacking. Once you've smoothed it out and then separate Peah, chayav, you have to say Truma Maestros. As opposed to Bikurim. The Brisa spells it out. I know. So he didn't change that word. Everyone else changed it to Bikurim based on Rav Cirilio. I'll let him know. He's Masha'en Ked Bikurim. You see in the words of the Brisa, Bikurim is different from Peah. Bikurim is potter from Trumas and Maestros, even if you're separating it after Meruach. But Lema, why don't we say that Brisa means something else? That the Chiyuv Maestros from Tzavua separated from Peah where it depends, before, after Miruach, Bikurim, maybe as far as Bikurim is concerned, you have to separate Bikurim from the Peah, maybe. Afapi Shalai Mirach. Maybe there's a new obligation to separate Bikurim from Peah. Maybe that's what he's telling me. Maybe the din is you're chayav to separate Bikurim from Peah, even though you separated Peah right at the beginning. Now, after Rabbi Yossi pushed away Rav Chagai, he brings another raya that Bikurim really is potter from Truma and Maaseh, even after stacking, after Meruach. Vaidam Rada, where is the source that Bikurim is potter from Truma and Maaseh, even if you separate it after Meruach? He says the source is V'lama Nikrashman Bikurin. Why is it called Bikurin? Why use that name? Shem Bikurin Lakol. They come before everything. You have to leave Bikurim first. Anything that comes first in the order of separating the tithes, wherever comes first, Chaverai Mischayaboy. So then the chiyuv which comes later has to have the first one, but the one which comes first doesn't have a later chiyuv that comes later on in the chain. Even if you end up separating it later, you don't have to separate a later tithe from one which is meant to be earlier. So the Mishnah is telling you Bikurim comes first for everything else. So we learn that if you're separating Bikurim, even after Miruach, you're not chayiv to separate Trumas and Maasros, because whatever comes first does not have any chiyuvim which come later on. Okay? So what you see here, the matanas have to be in order, right? So Truma is separated from what comes after you've separated Bikurim. And the third matana Maaser Rishon, what's left after you've separated Truma, and so on. So it's got to be in that order. So Bikurim has no chiyuv of any Truma obligation. Okay? Now, we learnt in our Mishnah that even after the produce has been cut, you can give produce as Peah. You're parted from Maasros until the smoothing out, okay? And the Mishnah adds the word la'olam. So even in a situation you've already done mitzvah Peah, let's say you left 1 in 60, and now you want to do more for the sake of Peah. It's parted from Chiyuv Maaseh. That's before Miruach, let's see. Masnisa de Beis Shammai. This Mishnah is like the view of Beis Shammai. The Beis Shammai, Hefker la'aniyim. If you make something ownerless for the poor, Hefker is considered potter from Maaseh. Therefore, the Mishnah is telling you any produce separated for the poor, even though there's not got a name Peah, because you've already separated the Shir Peah. But if you've done it only for these people, it's still considered Hefker, and therefore, even though it's only for the poor, and therefore that's still good enough, it's considered Hefker, and it's potter from Maaseh. Okay? But now we spoke about, you're taking produce and you're sewing it back again. Like it's parted from mice just until it's smoothed out. Divrei Rabbi Akiva, that's the words of Rabbi Akiva. So let's see what he's saying. But ask you Rabbi Akiva, the dinner of Rabbi Akiva, that you can sow produce where maestros has not been taken from it. Before Meruach, you can sow it back in the ground, but not after smoothing. This is Kachanus B'nei Chanon, like the opinion brought in a brisa, which was the shopkeepers of B'nei Chanon. Now, unfortunately, they didn't have a good name. The Tana, we've learned. Lama Chavu Chanus B'nei Chanon Shalish Shonim Ad Shlei Char Beis Mikdash. They were destroyed 3 years before the Churban. These shopkeepers. Shahayim Maitzien Asaperes Michlal Maasros. They were taking produce, taking it out of its Maaser obligation. You know what they did? They sold it in their shops after Miruach without taking Maasros. Why? The Abidarshin, they would look at the Psukim. Now the Pasuk says, Aseh to Aseh is called to Asarecha. So they say, Aseh to Aseh, you take Aseh Maasros on what you've sown, you have to take Maaser, Perat Lelekeach, to exclude someone who buys it, is potter from separating Maaser. V'achalta, and the produce that you eat, you have to take Maaser, Perat Lemoicha, to exclude someone who sells produce, you're potter from separating Maaser. So according to the Din Torah, this is what they said. Produce which is sold, there's no chiyuv, not on the seller, not on the buyer. The Chachamim were masakin the chiyuv Maaser is also on stuff which was sold. And the Bnei Chanon followed the Torah Din. They didn't follow the Rabbanon. They went against the Chachamim. They never separated Maasers. And that's why they were punished that their shops were destroyed. Based on this drasha, we learn from the word V'achalta that the fruit that you sow is potter from Chiyuv Maaseros because it's not going to be eaten. And that's the view of Rabbi Akiva in our Mishnah, who holds
won't be eaten.
The stuff that you sow back. You take produce and you sow it back in the ground. So since it's not going to be eaten, And that's the view of Rabbi Kiva in our Mishnah, that you're allowed to sow produce which is not taken Maisa. And just like pears which are sold, it says in the Brisa, now Min HaTorah they're potter from Maisrus. The Chachamim said there was a Chiyuv Maisrus, and that's why they were punished. But same thing with fruit which is sowed. Rabbi Kiva holds in our Mishnah, even though Min HaTorah is potter from Maisrus, the Chachamim were Masakin Chiyuv Maisrus. So he says you shouldn't sow it if you've not taken Maisa after stacking, after smoothing out. But the dinner of Rabbi Kiva in our Mishnah, you're allowed to sow it when it's not taken Maisa before Miruach, but not after the smoothing. And that fits in with this brisa, which didn't like the people, the shopkeepers of the Chanuyas, the Bnei Chanun, because they went against the words of the Chachamim. So you understand, it was before the smoothing was done, then he allowed them to start sowing it back into the ground. Cohen and Levi shalakhu, a Cohen and Levi who bought stuff, we said in our Mishnah, a Cohen and Levi who bought produce which has not had Maisa taken before smoothing, the Trumas and Maisrus are theirs. If they buy it, produce which has not had Maisa taken after smoothing, they have to give it to other Kohanim. Let's see, why is that? After smoothing, they have to give it to someone else. Why? Oh, Rabbi Yochanan, the din is, if they buy things after Miruach, they should be able to separate it for themselves. But Knas, Konsulai, and Chachamim put a fine on them, give it to others. We don't want them running to the granaries there to buy fruit with no Maisa, and the other Kohanim will lose out. Right? They'll get first in line and hang around over there all day long waiting. Right? Now another case where a Kohen has to give his matanas to other Kohanim, Tabach, a butcher who acquires meat and slaughters them and sells the flesh, who's a Kohen, Chavrai b'shem b'Shobel Levi, Poiteloi, they exempt him from giving the Zerah L'chaim Mekeva to other Kohanim for Shabbos Achas for 1 week. He's allowed to keep them for himself. After that, he has to give it out. Oh, Rabbi Yossi, Azalis LeDorem, I went to the south of Eretz Yisrael, Shema is Rav Chanan Avoy, I heard Shema Rav Chanan, the father of Shimon ben Shem Rav Yeshua ben Levi, Patale, he parted to give Matanas Gehuda, Shabbos Achas, again, for a whole week. But after that, he has to give it. Rav Yudan Medamele, so Rav Yudan compared this din of the butcher, Lahadod Rav Yochanan, to the din about a Kohen and Levi who buy produce after smoothing. They have to give the matanas to other Kohanim. Because Knas Konsuben, there was a fine put on them that the other Kohanim shouldn't lose. So the same thing here. A butcher has to give the matanas to Kanas Chachamim. We don't want the other Kohanim to all lose out on the matanas Kohuna. Rabbi Yosef says, but if you want to put a fine on them, then why the first week they can keep it for themselves? And then I feel of Shabbos Achos lo yiftolai. Why should we let him get away with it for the first week? Right? They should give all the matanas to the other Kohanim even the first week. Why are we getting away with the first week? So we don't really have an answer for that. Since he said he'll potter from giving in the first week, it sounds like the din is not because of a knas, for some other reason. Okay. This is Kohen. Similar if you have a butcher who's a Kohen, right? Who sells meat in a shop. Rabbi Yudan said, Poitrulai. Again, we pater, this sort of widens the discussion. We pater him from giving the matanas to Kohanim for Shabbos Achas for 1 week. Rabbi Yossi Amar, he says, Ein Poitrulai Shabbos. No, we don't even give him an exemption of 1 week. Whereas Rabbi Yudan says we give him an exemption. So it's like the butcher we quoted before. Now, according to Rabbi Yossi, it's the din of a shopkeeper might be a bit worse, a bit more severe. Al-Da'at Rabbi Yossi, Ma ben Chemeni, Ma ben Tabach. So the butcher, he gave him an allowance, and the shopkeeper, he doesn't give him an allowance. So he says this is a butcher who sells the meat in the shop. He doesn't give him an allowance of 1 week. What's the difference? Why is it the butcher is potter from these matanas in the first week, and a shopkeeper is chayav to give the matanas even in the first week? He says, Chemeni, the shopkeeper who goes from town to town, Yochal Laharim, he'll cheat. He'll say, oh, this is my first week. He goes to another town, this is my first week. He goes to another town, this is my first week. Whereas Tabach, the butcher who sells in one place, he can't start cheating everywhere. Now, once we've learnt that a Cohen and Levi buy produce which has not taken Maisa, after Miruach, they have to separate the Truma and Maisa, their mafresh, to other Kohanim. The Gemara brings a similar din about a poor man who acquired fruit which has not had Maisa taken. Does he have to give Maisa Oni to other Aniyim or not? The poor man who separates Maisa. Tani, we learned in the Brisa, there's no argument, Rabbi and Rabbi Huda, a Jew buys fruit, which is mechuba from a guy, shein chayavim b'masris. You definitely have to separate masris. and connected fruit of a Jew. Shenichnas, so basically, tachtav, he's gone to a field of a guy instead of the guy, yeah? So he's taken over the field from the guy, and he also has to separate maestros. And if a Jew buys detached fruit, it's complete, it's all complete, min guy, sheim b'turis min maestros. So if you buy it from a guy complete, you don't have to separate. What is the argument? You buy ordinary fruit from another Jew b'shnas Maseh Ani during the Maseh Ani year. Maseh Ani year is 1, 2, 4, and 5. Am I right? Maseh Sheni is 3 and 6. Maseh Ani is 1, 2, 4, and 5. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says, when your buyer is poor or rich, we take the Maseh Ani from him because an Ani can't hold the Maseh Ani for himself. But Rabbi said, Asher, rich man, we take it away miyado from him. Ani, but with a poor man, we don't take it away. He can hold the maser for himself. He can keep it for himself. Why does he say even a poor man who buys it has to separate maser ani and give it to others? So the Gemara answers, your own field, you can't get the forgotten gleanings there in your own field. You have to give it to the other poor. So also Maseh Ani, give it to the other poor. Don't keep it for yourself. What's Rebbe's reason? Just finish the paragraph, yeah? What's the reason for Rebbe who patters the poor man from separating Maseh Ani to other poor? Why do he also agrees that poor man has to leave a bit of his own field, like a shikha for other poor, so he should separate Maseh Ani. So the Gemara answers, like a shikha ein on tovlin. They don't make the produce tevel before they've been separated. Maseh Ani, as opposed to Maseh Ani Shehu Tovel, which creates a tevel status before it's separated. In that situation, you bought fruit, which was complete fruit. Kfar Nitval, it became tevel Adru B'Shus Shalvishan, when it was in the domain of the first person. When it was in the Shus of the owner of the field, it was tevel. Now you sell it afterwards to an Ani, it's mixed in Maseh Ani of the first owner. And when you separate the Maseh Ani, it's like separated through the owners, the original owners. Therefore, the one who buys it can keep it for himself. What's this? 1 second. When you buy fruit, it became tevel when it was in the domain of the first person, right? And then later on it's sold, it's as if it's mixed, like the Maseh Ani of the Baal Sadeh. And when you separate the Maseh Ani, it's as if it's separated from as if the first person separated it. You understand? So when the Ani now can keep it for himself, because it's as if the first owner separated it earlier on, and therefore the buyer is allowed to hold it for himself. It's like mixed with the fruit which was in the seller's hand. So if I was the Ani who's buying it, it's as if he's received Maseh Ani from the seller. You understand? Even though he's the one separating it, it's as if he received it from the seller, and therefore he can keep it for himself. Then what's the reason for Yehuda Nasi, who's mechayiv, a poor man who buys fruit, to give the Maseh Ani to other Aniyim? Surely it's considered the Maseh Ani of the seller. Why doesn't the poor man keep it for himself? So the Gemara answers, the truth is, the Ani who buys has not got a chiv to give Maseh Ani to other poor people. But the Chachamim were masakin it b'shum knaf, because of a fine. Just like our Mishnah obligated a Cohen and Levi who buy tevel, right, which has not had Maisa taken after Miruach. They have to separate Trumas and Maisas and give it to other Kohanim. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is Machayev, a poor man who buys fruit, which is already out of Maseh Ani obligation to give it to others. So here as well, they wanted to stop Aniyim buying fruit which has not had Maisa taken, buying it cheap, so that they will lose out on the Maseh Ani from other poor. But if that's the case, Matavad Rabbanan, Matavad Rebbe. What's the reason then for Rebbe who holds that a poor person who buys tevel doesn't have to give Maseh Ani to other people? Why is that? Why don't we put a fine on him like they put the Chachamim on the Cohen and the Levi who buy tevel? So the Gemara answers, Asher, if the Cohen's rich, yesh biyoda likach, he's got money to buy a lot of fruit, which is, which has not had Maisa taken, okay? He can buy it, so there's a knas on him. But Ani, the poor man, what's he got? En biyoda likach, he can't buy a lot of fruit cheap. Therefore, there's no reason to put a takana to prevent him from buying tevel, which is cheap. And the Gemara explains what their argument's based on. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi Omer, he said, Matzah Hulovos, the poor man will find lenders. So the Chachamim are masakin sakana for the poor to stop them jumping and buying big amounts of tevel and causing losses to the other poor. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is worried, he'll find the money, don't worry, he'll be able to buy what he needs. And Rabbi said, the poor man's going to come for a loan, he's not going to get the loan. He's not going to be able to get the loan, therefore there's no reason to put a sakana as far as the other poor are concerned.